Hi everyone, I wanted to talk to you today about the chapter on love. First of all, what is love? How do we define love? How do we experience love? That's a question I'm throwing out to you to think about in terms of your own personal experience. Because we experience love, we use the word love to describe a lot of different kinds of relationships. We can also talk about inanimate objects. We love our family, we love our friends. We may have a romantic partner who we love. You might love a book, you might love school, you might love your car. We use the word to describe a whole range of feelings that are not the same. So when we talk about love, it's a multifaceted experience and a multifaceted feeling. In this chapter, they focus on these different aspects of love and different theories about how we examine love and what we think about love. And the first one they talk about is the biochemical one. The assumption that when you fall in love, something literally gets released into your brain that makes you feel this feeling that you identify as being in love. And that thing that's released are natural amphetamines. So you're like on speed. So sometimes when people are, quote, falling in love, they'll talk about they can't sleep, they feel kind of anxious and fidgety, they've lost their appetite, they don't want to spend time with their friends. All of a sudden they're consumed with this other person. So this is the biochemical explanation, is that these are natural amphetamines, and that all of us are biologically, genetically programmed to respond to a particular type of person. So it might be a very attractive person with dark hair, dark eyes would trigger this response in you. Equally attractive person with light skin, blonde hair, blue eyes wouldn't. So the assumption here is very biological and very biochemical, and that you are programmed to respond, that when you respond, this is what happens. Chemicals get released into your brain and your nervous system that make you feel agitated and butterflies in your stomach, and this is what you think love is. And that can't last, so eventually it has to switch over to quieter endorphins and stuff like that. There's mixed evidence about whether this is really true or has any validity, but if we think of the song like Elvis Presley's All Shook Up, he talks about being in love and itching like a man on a fuzzy tree. So that's that physical feeling. The second major theory is the attachment theory of Mary Ainsworth, where she talks about three kinds of attachments. And she says basically that when we're children, the basic core attachment that we get with the parent who's the primary caretaker either is going to make us feel secure or totally insecure, or anxious and ambivalent. So what does that mean? It means that if your parents are pretty responsive most of the time, to the point where you develop a basic sense of trust in them, that you can count on them to respond. When you cry, they come. When you're hungry, they feed you. That this attachment that you get to this person feels secure. And that if you have that kind of secure attachment to somebody, it's a positive experience of what love is. It's a prototype for what love is. And that as an adult, you're much more likely to be drawn into healthy relationships with people who are reliable, trustworthy, and who meet your emotional and physical needs. On the other extreme, when we have parents who are neglectful, parents who are emotionally and sometimes even physically unavailable, do not respond appropriately, you cry and you're left to cry, you're not fed appropriately on time, or have your diaper changed appropriately on time, or picked up and talked to, that these are toxic relationships, and that these kinds of relationships are going to cause you to not trust people, because if you can't trust your first caretakers on whom you were totally dependent, why would you trust other people as you go through life? So the assumption here is that you develop an avoidant kind of attachment, which is that you have attachments that are very superficial, that are very much, for the moment, that you're not looking for a deep relationship. You're certainly not looking for a dependent relationship, because you can't depend on people. The one in the middle is the tricky one. The one where parents are attentive a lot of the time, but they're also not attentive a lot of the time. So you get a mixed bag. What that creates in the child is a longing for more connection. But it also creates anger in the child, so that when they get the connection, they feel very ambivalent about the connection. So in these kinds of situations, they feel that when you get older, you get into relationships where you're craving connection, you're craving closeness, but once you get it, you're not so good at it. You're not so good at maintaining it and trusting it. You may test it a lot. You may throw out all kinds of test to this other person to see if they pass the test to prove that they really are connected to you. So this anxious ambivalent type is much more difficult to manage, and for many people this is exactly typical of the kinds of relationships that they get into. Always trying to overcome distance, but once the closeness is achieved, they cannot sustain that kind of emotional intimacy, and they can't trust being dependent and vulnerable to this person, so they're constantly in a position of trying to test them. So that's the attachment theory. There's a triangular theory of Sternberg, who talks about love being made up of different components: passion, intimacy, and commitment. Passion being the thing that draws you to a person, physical attraction. Intimacy being emotional intimacy, meaning trust, honesty, something that develops over time as you disclose more about yourself, find out more about the other person, and as a result of that, create more of an attachment that's not just based on the physical attraction, but also on the emotional, intellectual attraction, other kinds of things that you share in common. So we have that. And then ultimately over time, the assumption is that you will develop a sense of commitment, that you want this to continue. So Sternberg said, ideally, a relationship has a good balance between these. It may start with an extreme passion that will cool off over time as you develop more of an emotional intimacy and as you develop more of a sense of commitment to a calmer thing. So this, in a way, is explaining the biochemical stuff, but not explaining it from a biochemical point of view, but rather from a relationship, emotional kind of point of view, that you go from this extreme intensity to a calmer, deeper commitment to somebody. John Lee also talks about different types of love, and if you look at his different types of love, they really are very much reflective of Sternberg, because Sternberg and Lee both talk about these combinations of emotions. So when you have passion, in Lee, that's eros, you see relationships that are very, very intense. So these are people who are infatuated. They talk about infatuation or having a crush. These can develop into very intense up and down roller coaster kinds of relationships. When you get the component of being more intimately connected, then you have a different type of love. So where Sternberg looks at, okay, let's suppose you had intimacy and commitment but no passion, you might have a friendship where there's deep emotional connection and a deep commitment to the relationship, but there's no passion in the relationship. Now, these things can change over time, obviously. So Lee and Sternberg both have versions of this, of talking about these components of love. Ultimately, when you think about yourself, when you think about what is love, how does it feel to you physically, emotionally, what are you looking for, what do you think is love for you? How do you know that you're in love with someone? How does somebody know you know that they're in love with you? What do they do in terms of caring, in terms of commitment, in terms of what is there? What are those elements for you, without using the theory necessarily, but in terms of if you could try to define it? Defining love is a tough thing to do, and of course, being that this is an academic course, we look at theories about people who try to break down stuff that's basically emotional and feels a certain way to us. We know when we're in love. We don't have to go look at a textbook and read a theory. We know what it feels like to us to be in love. We know how we want to feel, what we think love should feel like, which is sometimes very unrealistic and overly romanticized. The other thing your textbook talks about are the functions of love. What function does it actually serve? And two things I want to briefly talk about is survival and emotional health. The assumption that it's not just the sexual thing that leads to procreation of the species, but it's the caring, loving part that allows us to raise families and to keep the species going on an emotional level. And that it's also necessary for our emotional health. If you're loved, that dramatically increases your self-esteem, rather than imagine if you don't feel loved by anyone or you feel that you're unlovable. That clearly has an impact on negative self-esteem and tends to draw you into negative relationships or abusive relationships or relationships that are manipulative. So, that's a big component. On the other hand, we see that single men are the most unhealthy group on earth, because when you're in a relationship with someone who you love and who loves you, you also take better care of yourself. because you feel that you have a responsibility towards another person. So we have that. And we have many experiments showing that emotional relationships can actually help people deal with illnesses, recover from serious illnesses, that love seems to have a healing power, that babies who are not held in orphanages suffer from a lack of growth, a failure to develop, to the point where even some orphanages will have volunteers come in just to hold babies and talk to them because this emotional connection is so important. Sometimes we can get it, particularly with the elderly, get it through a pet, where they don't have many human connections, but having a pet gives an emotional, loving, compassion feeling that brings up, again, endorphins and other kinds of chemicals in our body that are soothing and healthy to our well-being. So clearly, love serves a function. On the downside, love doesn't always end well. Sometimes it can be manipulative. Sometimes it can be extraordinarily destructive, particularly if you're drawn into abusive relationships. The two things they talk about specifically in this chapter are narcissism and jealousy. Narcissism are people who are totally consumed with themselves and their needs to the point of exploiting others. They need your constant attention. If you're going to be in a relationship with a narcissist, you have to know that your function there is to make them feel better, make them feel loved. They cannot reciprocate. They don't have the ability to reciprocate because they cannot experience what other people are experiencing. They only know what their experience and what they need and what they want. So, extreme narcissists are a very extreme group who always want their way, always want you to agree with them, always want you to support them, but they're not necessarily there for you in any kind of way. So you have to feel like this is worth it for some reason. I had a patient of mine who was very good friends with a very famous actress, and he said, that she's a total narcissist. She's never going to call you to see how you're feeling or what you need. It's always going to be the other way around. But being part of her world is exciting and fun. And so if the price you pay is catering to her emotionally and physically in terms of her needs, it's worth it for him to be involved in this world. So that's the way it's got to be, because narcissists are never going to be satisfied with the attention of one person. They're always going to need the attention of as many people as they can get every moment, every day. Other people are their emotional fuel. They need it to feel okay about themselves, because narcissists at their core feel worthless. So they constantly have to prove their value by getting your attention and your praise and your love. Jealousy, if you think about jealousy, is it normal or not normal? It depends. It could be normal if it's really that the relationship is threatened in some way and you're feeling jealous in response to that. Some people, however, again, are very insecure. As a result of that, they're jealous about anything. You talk to another person, you smile at somebody, anything will promote their jealousy, even to the extreme of becoming physically abusive. And unfortunately, in some relationships, people will rationalize this, that this form of jealousy shows that somebody cares, and that this kind of jealousy is a form of love. It's not a form of love. It's a form of narcissism, really, because it's somebody saying, I'm worried about me and how I feel. Okay? And so the idea that they're doing this because they love you is not the case. They're doing this because they feel threatened. Okay? And they may feel threatened by anything. So your behavior is responsible for their feelings. So my advice would be stay away from narcissists and stay away from people who are controlling and jealous people, because they're not going to change. People like this is who they are, this is their character. It's not about the relationship with you, it's about them. And anybody in a relationship with them has to be willing to put up with this kind of behavior.